Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I was hoping that there was going to be a longer summer break, but there's just a bit too much going on in the world to ignore. And I'll start with Venezuela. And it's a good thing I didn't immediately rush to record a podcast describing this as a US invasion of Venezuela, because it turns out to be a great deal stranger than that, and probably more pointless than an actual invasion. The reason why I'm talking about this at all, I mean, who cares what happens in South America, right, is that the US under President Donald Trump is going completely rogue, something that has enormous consequences for Australia and the Western Alliance, and as a result is being studiously ignored by all of our politicians and national security people. In fact, the prevailing attitude, such as I'm capable of tuning into it, seems to be to double down, to think of ways to tie Australia even closer to what looks like a completely out-of-control US administration. Now, I think a wise country would be stepping back a bit, as many Europeans are, with the partial exception of the complete toady Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister. France is cautious, as are Germany, Italy, and the Nordic countries, and I'll get to the horrifying situation involving Greenland in just a moment. But sticking with Venezuela just for now, on the 3rd of January, the United States launched a large assault on the country using airstrikes to destroy the air defense network and pave the way for special forces to go in by helicopter and seize, kidnap, President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in what must be close to a flawless operation. No US troops were killed, though around 80 Venezuelan and Cuban bodyguards lost their lives, but I suppose who cares about them? Early reaction to the attack was very mixed. It's clearly a breach of international law, but Maduro is a total thug who has continued the destruction of his country, imprisoned and tortured political opponents, and reduced a previously rich nation to abject poverty. There were immediate high hopes that by removing him, the government would change, and waiting in the wings is the current Nobel Peace Prize recipient and leader of the Venezuelan opposition, Maria Machado. But here is where the story takes an alarming and disturbing turn. Having done the right thing, it would seem, by removing Maduro, President Trump and his band of goons, exemplified by Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, a clearly unwell person, a screaming maniac who behaves like someone who belongs in a padded room, they have left the rest of Maduro's regime in place and seem happy to deal with it, because it turns out that none of this has anything to do with the Venezuelan people or the restoration of democracy. It's all about US companies getting greater access to the country's huge oil reserves. In fact, President Trump has already gone out of his way to rule out putting Maria Machado in power, saying she wasn't respected by the Venezuelan people. Now, that's a complete lie. And Machado is the head of a very widespread opposition movement that, going by the results of the last election, which Maduro ignored, she probably has the support of about 70% of the people. What is really happening here, and it's so hard to believe because these are the actions of a tin pot dictator in Africa or Central Asia. Donald Trump doesn't like Mrs. Machado because he believes she should have given her Nobel Peace Prize to him because he thinks he deserves it. In fact, the two are due to meet next week, and we might witness one of the most disgusting diplomatic stunts in the modern era if the poor woman is so intimidated, humiliated, and belittled by Trump that she feels forced to hand over her gold medal signifying the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, on the motivation of access to oil, that's falling completely flat. I mentioned before Christmas Trump's view of the war in Iraq was that the US should have gone in and taken all of the country's oil, presumably believing that it was lying around on top of the ground and could somehow be scooped up and shipped back to the US. Well, not surprisingly, it turns out it's much more complicated than that. Who would have guessed? And Venezuela's oil infrastructure is so run down, it will take billions of dollars of investment over many years to get it back up to speed. And the early signs are that the big US companies, such as Chevron, aren't particularly interested in spending all that money. So if it's not really about oil and it's not about regime change, what could have been the motivation? Well, no one is really sure. But given the pettiness of the behavior of Donald Trump, I mean, it's really something you would expect from an 8-year-old child. Possibly the best theory I've heard is that Maduro had started making dances at public functions that might have been mocking Donald Trump's own strange dances to songs such as YMCA at his Nuremberg-style rallies, and that Trump was so enraged that he decided to remove Maduro from power and to loot as much of Venezuela's oil as possible. There's a lot more to come on this, but let's move on, because this is a huge topic in its own right, because we have in play a far more disturbing set of circumstances even than Venezuela, namely Trump's renewed and amplified calls that the US has to own Greenland. Now, this is appalling stuff. Greenland is administered by Denmark, which is, of course, a NATO country. Denmark was, in fact, one of the founders of the organization. The US currently has a major base on Greenland. At the end of World War II, it had around 20, but gradually closed them down, presumably to save money. Now, the Danish government has been absolutely clear, and repeatedly so, that if the US wants to reopen them and have more troops on Greenland, that's fine by them. The island also has rich deposits of rare earth minerals, most of them under a very thick layer of ice, and again, the government of Denmark, in consultation with Greenland residents and local politicians, has said that if the US wants to come up with some environmentally sound, economically viable ways of mining those reserves, that's also fine by them. I have it on very good authority that the Prime Minister of Denmark asked Trump directly what he wanted that he couldn't get with the cooperation of Denmark, and apparently he was completely unable to explain his thinking. Now, as shocking as this should be to all sensible people, the only reason he is threatening to take Greenland using military force if necessary is that I think he wants to go down simply as a president who expanded the size of the United States. It's as simple and as shocking as that. What we are looking at is the end of the international rules-based order, a favourite talking point of our Defence Minister Richard Marles. The US suddenly and very clearly is no longer interested in cooperating with other countries or preserving democracy or working with the United Nations or defending human rights. All of that has gone. Its sole motivation now is to grab as much as it can with both hands because it has the world's most powerful military and isn't scared to use force when it wants to. If the US seizes Greenland, which it may well do, I'm putting it at better than a 50% probability at the moment, it will totally destroy NATO. One NATO member country attacking another. That's really the end of it. So here's a question in advance for Australian politicians. Will you support NATO, Denmark, and the people of Greenland, or will you support a totally unjustified US power grab? And I fear I already know the answer to that one. And by the way, think about this for a moment. Greenland is a large, sparsely populated island, rich in resources, and with an insignificant military run by a friendly pro-US country. Think about this. Are there any other countries fitting that description? Large island, sparsely populated, lots of minerals, insignificant military. Well, of course, that's also a description of Australia. And if the US can seize Greenland, there's no reason why we couldn't also be a target. And I defy any pro-US boosters like Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, or Richard Marles to explain to me why it would be okay for the US to grab Greenland, but not to do exactly the same thing to other countries, including Australia. This is the world that we are now living in, and it's vital that we start adjusting to this new reality. We need to re-examine AUKUS and stop shoveling money at the US to make it happen. As people know, I've always had profound doubts about the ability of the US to sell us second-hand Virginia-class submarines, but now I can add other things to that list that concern me. The US says it now wants to focus on the Western Hemisphere, something I discussed in December after the release of the outrageous national security strategy, which was profoundly anti-European while at the same time somewhat pro-Russian and pro-China. Now, in 1 or 2 years, the US might decide it no longer needs the nuclear submarine base at HMAS Sterling that we are spending $7 billion of our money constructing for them. That's on top of money that we're shoveling to the US submarine industrial base and various other expenses. I've touched on this before, and it's now looking more likely, rather than less, that the US will withdraw, gradually perhaps, from Asia. Oh, by the way, I was speaking with a Chinese diplomat last week, and I asked if AUKUS would be a topic for April's summit between President Trump and President Xi in Beijing. I was slightly surprised to be told, I think it was an on-the-record conversation, that the summit probably won't go ahead because the US side, so far, has completely failed to come up with a sensible agenda for the meeting. The diplomat explained to me that President Xi is a very busy man and he is not going to be used as a prop for some sort of grandstanding PR visit to Beijing, a photo op, for Donald Trump. That's just not going to happen. So I'll watch that one very closely. I suppose it's possible that the US will get their act together, but the fact that we are now in January, these high-level summits normally take months, if not years, of preparation, and it sounds like the Americans have done next to nothing. There's also, in the mind of President Trump, a connection between China and Greenland. I keep on circling back to Greenland because I really, really think that this is one of the most important issues that's going to confront countries like Australia in the next few months. I listened to one of Trump's rambling press conferences, and he talked about Greenland being surrounded by Russian warships and Chinese warships, and that he wasn't going to sit by while they occupied the country. This is complete fiction. There aren't armadas of Russian and Chinese ships around Greenland. The occasional Russian warship probably transits, either from the Northern Fleet or the Pacific Fleet. There are probably Russian submarines active in the area, transiting through that on their way to the Atlantic. As for the Chinese Navy, I can't think of any particular reason why they would be there. You might get the occasional hydrographic research vessel. These things usually have some military application as well as scientific. But this is a complete nonsense that somehow other powers are getting ready to invade Greenland. Now, what else? Iran is falling apart. As I record this, the civil unrest is increasing. The country is a real mess. The autocratic clerical regime is doing their usual thing of cracking down very hard, which means shooting protesters. The United States, again, Donald Trump, has said that the US might intervene militarily there as well. What that intervention might look like is unclear to me. The US and Israel have already done significant damage to Iran's military infrastructure with the strikes on the nuclear facilities, plus in parallel, Israel also targeted the upper levels of the Revolutionary Guards Corps. So I don't think they're in the best shape. Anyway, let's hope whatever happens in Iran that it is resolved as peacefully as possible, because that country has such a tragic history, and that it's the end of the clerical regime and a return to some form of democracy. But speaking of democracy, and I'm trying to cover a lot of ground here, I'm also very concerned about the state of US internal politics with the shooting by ICE, the immigration enforcement people, of a lady by the name of Renee Good in Minneapolis because of Christmas and cricket and bushfires. I don't know if people have been following this closely, but for me it was a very disturbing shooting of an unarmed woman trying to drive away from an ICE-controlled checkpoint and being shot by an agent who didn't appear to be in any particular danger. The woman herself had been quite calm and composed. There's a stack of video of this on the internet, so if people are in doubt or have different interpretations, they can go and look at the raw footage themselves. But what I found even more disturbing than the shooting itself, a woman shot 3 times in the face, was the instant fire hose of lies coming from the US leadership, including President Trump himself, who instantly said that it was justified, saying without any evidence that she was a paid senior left-wing radical agitator. No truth to that whatsoever. And I fear that some very dark days are coming up for the US and their system of democracy, or what little of it still exists, and the pressure that the system is under from within. I have had my doubts for some time that I've expressed previously that the scheduled congressional midterm elections will take place in November. In fact, those doubts are being amplified by the circumstances around the Renee Good shooting, with this complete demonization, supposedly, of Democrats and the left wing and all of that sort of stuff. For me, and ICE itself is a paramilitary armed organization that it owes its loyalty to Donald Trump. He's, via Kristi Noem, but it's basically an organization that is at his command. And if that's deployed in the lead up to the November midterms, it could really warp the outcome. As I say, the reaction in Australia to all of this, and again, I do accept that it's Christmas holidays, it's just business as usual. Well, please, our leaders, wake up to the fact that it is not business as usual, and you are going to have to start thinking about what the world looks like with a rogue United States unable and unwilling to support Australia. And a couple of other things. I saw a couple of news items from Ukraine. Our donated Abrams main battle tanks have been involved in some fighting around the destroyed city of Pokrovsk. I'm correcting a previous report that I made that they were being used as static artillery. It turns out that in rare circumstances, you can use main battle tanks in direct combat, the role for which they were originally designed, but you can't use them in massed formations. I don't know how many Australian Abrams were involved. My guess would be 2 or 3. One was destroyed by a drone, but the Ukrainians said that it had successfully completed its mission, which was as part of a limited counteroffensive around the completely destroyed town of Pokrovsk. Finally, in my last podcast, I had just started to mention the terrible terrorist attack in Bondi, and I note that our Prime Minister had to be dragged kicking and screaming to announce a royal commission, and let me explain in the next episode why he had to be dragged to what for me seemed to be an obvious thing to do. And I'll give you a hint, it's part of the same syndrome of stubbornness and self-righteousness that means any concerns about ANZUS are rapidly brushed off. Thank you very much for listening. Happy New Year. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.